It doesn't say
There are two-
premenstrual.
It says before their menses.
Yeah.
So I'm saying there's two tafsir. One of them says both Maududi. One of them says it could be because they're never going to mention, like it could be that they have some physical condition. But the other one says, or because they are not yet mature. I like your badge. So yeah, so do you find a discrepancy then between Sharia?
No, I think that you need to understand how it works, right? So, first of all, there's difference of opinion among the scholars.
Yes.
Do you want, if you, because you can't.
There's two that I've given you, Jalalain and Maududi.
These are Maududi is not a jurist in that sense.
Okay, so Jalalain.
Jalalain is a mufassir, so he's an exegete.
He puts
And by
it
the way,
in
it's not,
brackets.
and that's two scholars, that's not one.
Yeah, I
Okay.
know, I just said I would be two.
No.
Quran,
Jalalain.
however, says don't forbid that which we
Jalalain.
Abbas says that Sharia prohibits the marriage of under.
Jalalain was written by two people.
Oh, I see. I thought you meant
Yeah. All right. Anyway, no, and it was actually it's an exegesis. It's not a book of law.
Yeah.
So it's important with these masail or these matters for it to go
Sharia
to.
is exegesis. It's not written in actual words
No.
in the Quran.
The way,
It's taken
no.
from the
So Sharia law is from the Quran and Sunnah, ijma, etc. Ijma meaning the
By
consensus.
saying, well, God forbids this, so we will say if you do this.
No. All right. So the books of Islamic law usually stipulate what are the do's and don'ts in Islam. Sometimes mufassirs can also contribute to that discussion, but it's not most fluidly elucidated in those books.
And what if it contradicts the Quran?
The point, okay, what I'm saying is that the way in which jurists, from an Islamic perspective, they come to conclusion is they look at the Quran, and within the Quran they look at the verses which are not abrogated, and the ones which are clear versus the ones which are not clear. If there's specific verses, when there's general ones or whatever.
Try and hold you to one specific verse which says that which we have allowed,
Yeah,
no man
I'm
shall
coming.
forbid.
But just so you know the framework. Then you have the hadith.
Yeah.
So after Quran is that the Sahih hadith. Then you have different gradations of hadith. So Hasan li ghayrihi,
Are
da'if.
those included in their contribution towards Sharia, the Hassan?
Yeah. So that is contributed towards understanding of Sharia. And then after that you have ijma'. Ijma' is basically the consensus of the scholars.
Right. So the scholars are important in their.
So how
when you
the-
said that
but-
that's scholarly.
Yeah,
you
so
didn't mean
when we
that's
say
less
consensus, is that when they all come together, when they all, no, not the majority, some describe it as a majority,
Consensus means
everyone.
majority.
In language it actually means everyone.
No, because of all the scholars, there's never going to be agreement among all of them.
Well, that's
a
an-
consensus
yeah.
of climate scientists say such and such, but that's not all of them.
I understand that's a really good point you're making, and I tend to agree with the sentiment, but there's some things, folks. But there's one thing that I was going to say was that there's some, and I wasn't talking about climate change, I'm not a
That's
scientist
my
in that.
exegesis.
Yeah, but so with ijma', with consensus, there's a discussion on it, but the point is this, is that there are some things which are definitely consensus.
Right.
For example, the five prayers a day, yeah?
Which
Or
are in the
Hajj.
Quran.
Hajj is in the Quran.
That is.
So for example, the 5 prayers a day, by the way,
Doesn't it say in the morning and the evening and the middle? So that's only 3 in my counting.
yeah, but the 5 prayers will by name and so on, and specifics are not in the
But
Quran.
can we get back to that
Yeah.
which is forbidden?
But you need to get the framework first, right? So
How long is
because
there a big framework?
when people say Sharia law,
Yep.
they're talking about what's gone through that framework.
Yes.
Now,
If it
invariably,
doesn't match the Quran, I would suggest that Sharia is in error in the Muslim
well, yeah,
perspective.
that's obviously, but the point is that the ones who make that decision are scholars amongst
Yeah,
themselves,
they're
right?
just human.
Yeah, so they all come to conclusions and so on.
Yep.
They have the exegetical schools. They try their best to come to their conclusion and so on.
Yep.
So now that we've got that out of the way,
Yeah.
the question of now marrying. So what is a nikah? A nikah in Arabic language is a kind of aqd, which means it's a kind of agreement.
Yes. Like a
So
contract.
yeah, so the scholars of old, they asked the question: is it possible for someone to have aqd nikah, which is this agreement to marry,
Yeah.
without having consummation or full rights? So for example, this is where the discussion comes.
Sorry, without already
Without-
having
yeah,
consummation.
so-
You can't consummate something that doesn't exist. Do you mean can they have get married
So
after they've already
no.
had-
So for example, the question is, can two people have this nikah agreement?
Marriage without any...
Without, yeah. So basically that person's, it's almost, it works
like a platonic marriage.
Nah, it just works like an engagement.
Okay.
So the scholars differed on this matter. Yeah, some scholars said, yeah, you can have it. So for example, in the olden days, say for example, I had a child, I had a daughter or something, yeah?
Within wedlock?
Pardon?
Within a marriage?
No, let's say I had a 5-year-old daughter.
But I'm saying within a marriage context. Your wife had
I had a daughter,
yeah.
Let's say a 5-year-old daughter, and I say, well, I've got cancer, or I'm going to go to war, and I think I'm going to die, and so on.
Yep.
So some scholars said, okay, look, I can draft a nikah agreement between my daughter, who's 5,
right.
and a man who's, let's say, 20 years old, but there's no sexual thing that happens, yeah.
Or would it eventually become that when she came
So
of age?
when does it happen? Now the scholars discuss this. They say, for example, Ash-Shawkani says this is not allowed. Ibn Uthaymeen of our present time says this is not allowed, but some scholars of the madhahib said they're allowed. So I said that these contracts are allowed. That, for example, if they get to a certain age, let's say 12, 13, 14, whatever age of ability, they call it qudra, which is ability. Pardon?
Ability for what?
Ability
to accept
ability to have intercourse.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Does that include emotional or like a,
So-
is it just physical?
Primarily it's physical, but it does include psychological and mental as well. Because if someone is not of mental age, or they haven't got the ability to, or they're judged by the people, their seniors to not be mature for marriage, then surely they wouldn't be put in that position. Okay.
So what I'd ask then is if Sharia forbids marriage, even in maybe 3 of the 5 schools, or if there's any prohibition on marrying a girl before her menstrual cycle begins, yet the Quran says this we find permissible and no man will forbid
Now,
that.
what the Quran talks about is divorce, right?
Yes.
So if someone has, so the verse you're talking about.
Abbas, I don't know what you referenced.
No, I don't know about Abbas. I'm sorry, I can't follow different. I can only tell you.
That's what I brought to you.
No,
that
all right.
question.
So in chapter 66 of the Quran, وَاللَّائِي لَمْ يَحِضْنَ, which means that the ones who have not menstruated yet.
Yeah, Jalalain says
All right.
because they are
So let's say that means that they've never had menstruation, not that they're pregnant, or which it could also mean.
Pre-menstrual.
Yeah, it could. Let's say it
No,
means.
not yet menstruated means they
Yeah,
can't be pregnant. They're
No.
pre-menstrual.
Let's say that's correct.
You're
Yeah.
talking about the first and the third category.
No. By the way, some mufassirs have said this means pregnant woman.
No, they're already included in the
Yeah, fine. But what I'm saying is, let's take your interpretation, or the interpretation of some of the scholars as well.
Most of them, I would imagine.
Not really,
Because
because
it says all those who are pregnant.
Fine.
So they can't be the same group of people being discussed. It says women who are pregnant,
yeah.
or women who are too old to menstruate.
Yeah. Good point.
Yeah.
No, you're right. I'm not disagreeing with you. So the ones who have not had menstruation yet. So here, this would refer to prepubescence.
Yes.
Yeah. Now this question of prepubescent marriage, you're correct. Is it prepubescence with intercourse or not? Now, here's what I'm saying is that this can't be, because it's haram. I'll tell you why it's haram.
Is it? So that's what I'm asking you.
Yeah.
Is it Sharia?
So I'll give you some references and sources right now. If the woman, no, it's,
I'll go and
you can go. I don't even think they're in English, so I'll tell you and you can check it out. For example, Kitab al-Insaf, written by al-Mirdawi, who is seen as the final opinion of the Hanbali madhab, in his Kitab al-Hudud.
Most of that was in Arabic. I'm just going to go with right then.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know what you just
He says, he lists in what he called a chapter of Hudud, which is punishments.
Chapter of what? Sharia
Punishments.
jurisprudence.
Chapter of
Chapter from the Quran.
No, I'm telling you what the scholars have said, and I'm going to give you.
Chapter of what I'm asking you? Chapter of Sharia.
Yeah, it's a Sharia book, yeah, or Sharia law, yeah. It's what I'm saying is the final opinion. It's seen as the final opinion of one of the schools of thought, the Hanbali school. 4. He says,
That includes Shia.
no.
So there's
Now
possibly
Sunni, and then you have other schools within the Shia. Sunni, there's 4 mainstream ones, yeah. Now, having said that, what he says is that if someone has intercourse in marriage with someone who's a prepubescent, the question is not whether they're doing the right or wrong thing. The question is whether they should be flogged or not, whether they should be whipped or not. And he was saying that they should be whipped.
So it's still prohibited. They're just now questioning what's the appropriate.
Yeah. So in other words, according to Al-Mirdawi.
So I would come back to how can they prohibit something which the Quran says?
No, but the Quran never talks about. Sorry to cut you off.
Find the verse.
No, I know the verse off by heart, right? Yeah, and I can recite the whole surah off by heart. But here's what I'm saying is that from the beginning of that surah, it doesn't say sexual intercourse.
I appreciate that, but
Right,
marriage,
so-
I would say the consensus of opinion is that marriage includes betrothal. Like you were saying, if you betroth your daughter and you feel that you're going to say eventually, can you take this wife for the moment? Can you be a protector, companion, maybe parent figure?
What's your name again?
Kate.
I don't shake hands with women. No, not even. You know this already.
Do I?
Yeah, anyways.
I study you.
No, you've been here already.
Just the Bible.
But here's what I was going to say to you, right? As I said to you before, in Islam, there are these distinctions. Now you're saying in
I'm
culture,
saying the Quran should supersede them.
the Quran doesn't.
From your perspective.
Listen, very clearly, the Quran never says that nikah yaqtadi al-jima', which means it never says.
Is it a generic verse? Is it saying anything the Quran ordains as acceptable?
Look,
We forbid that.
Let me say this one more time.
We're
I just need to make this very. I want to make this very clear for you, right? I've said to you before that this nikah agreement, according to Ibn Qudam al-Maqdisi, he wrote a book called Al-Mughni, and the chapter is Bab al-Nikah. He mentions that nikah is like aqd, which means any agreement, any business agreement, any deal. Now here's what I'm saying to you is that the scholars of old, they debated on whether or not it's possible. Say if I've got a daughter, I can.
That's betrothal, though, is my
Right.
It's
But
not marriage.
whatever. But
Marriage ceremony.
the point.
You're saying, can you please?
Yeah. No. How? This is the question. Now, what if she gets to the age and she says, "I don't want to get married. I don't want it." Now, Shawkani says, if she says, one other scholar, he says, if she gets to the age that of discernment,
Yep.
and she gets to the age of ability, and she doesn't want to be with this person who her father suited her with,
Yep.
then she can reject it based on the hadith, al-bikru tusta'dhan, based on the hadith that the virgin has to be asked for permission before marriage takes place.
Yep.
So how do they do jama'? Shawkani says that the way he does jama' between the hadith, or he puts them together, and the ayah and so on and so forth in the Quran, is that he says that, okay, you can have a nikah, technically, with someone who hasn't reached the age of the discernment yet. Yet, when she gets to the age, she can decide whether or not, number one. Number two, that he can't have sex with her until she gets to the age of ability.